The Kalb Report is funded by a grant from the Ethics and Excellence in Journalism Foundation. From the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., this is the Kalb Report with Marvin Kalb.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and to another edition of the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb, and our program today we're calling In Search of Truth. And we'll bring that program to you virtually because of the continuing pandemic. Once upon a time, we had, at least many of us did, a commonly accepted understanding of basic truths, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, for example, a simple phrase that came to define American democracy. Now, in these troubling times, at least since the 9/11 terrorist attack on the United States 20 years ago, that commonly accepted understanding of basic truths seems to have broken down. Our politics reduced to an ugly era of tribal and rhetorical warfare. Now, without that commonly accepted understanding of basic truths, basic facts on which we base our decisions, our government's decisions, how do we maintain and then sustain a viable, functioning democracy? The question, in my opinion, is so fundamental that I'm going to pass on trying to answer it at this point and turn to three veteran journalists and try to get their opinion about what is happening at this time to our democracy. First, Judy Woodruff, the anchor and managing editor of the PBS NewsHour. She has covered Washington politics for more than 4 decades, starting at NBC, then going on to CNN, before reaching PBS. She's covered every corner of politics and policy and won every prize in the book, and deservedly so. Next, Eugene Robinson, a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the Washington Post, capping a 3-decade-long career at the paper as a City Hall reporter, a foreign correspondent, an editor, and now a columnist. He's also an analyst at MSNBC. Completing this estimable troika is Ted Koppel, who worked at ABC News for 42 years as a war correspondent and a diplomatic correspondent before anchoring and editing Nightline from 1980 to 2005. He's won every honor TV news can bestow on anyone, also written books and op-eds, and is now a senior contributor to the CBS News Sunday morning show. So, dear colleagues, where do we go from here? If each side abides only by its own truths, and each side uses only its own facts, how dangerous is it for this wonderful thing called American democracy? Is it really in trouble? And to what extent? And Judy, I'd like to start with you first, please.
Marvin, first of all, I'm so honored to be part of this panel. You first and foremost, of course, but also with and your incredible career, Ted Koppel, with, as you said, just an estimable career that knows every award you can think of. And Eugene Robinson, we can't read the Washington Post without becoming a lot smarter reading your columns, Eugene. So I'm so pleased to be part of this conversation and so look forward to hearing what you all have to say. Our democracy is in trouble, in my view. We are built on a set of beliefs, a foundation that goes back to the earliest days when the truth mattered. Democracy, as we know it, of course, going back much earlier than the founding of our country, and our understanding of the importance of truth and facts, and at least trying to aim for some semblance of that in order to establish a society where people are respected, where ideas are respected, where science is respected. So it's earlier than the founding of our country, but you're absolutely right. That's what our country began on. And it's not to say that we haven't had disagreements over the years. We've had disagreements over the biggest issues facing the country, from the revolutionary days to the Civil War, the ultimate and bloody disagreements over slavery, the terrible disagreements as we moved into the 20th century over the treatment of women in American politics, over everything from taxes to the war in Vietnam, and more recently, of course, Afghanistan, Iraq, and the list goes on. But we are now in an era, Marvin, where it's not just disagreement. It's a view that the other side is not just wrong, but they are basing their opinion on something that is false, that is not based in any sort of fundamental set of facts that we can all count on. And that's led us down this perilous path where we are right now, where we have people saying vaccinations aren't safe, where we have people denying the results of the election in 2020. And it's, I know we're going to be talking about it for this program, but we have some real fundamental splits in our political life right now, and in our personal lives. Families are divided over this. And so it is very much a threat to our democracy, and it's something that all of us need to be focused on and thinking about how do we address it.
Eugene Robinson, your views, please.
Well, first of all, I too am honored to be here among such esteemed colleagues and good friends. I agree with Judy, and I have come to a degree of alarm that I didn't have a few years ago. You could see 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you could see that we were sort of dividing into what looked to me like two information universes, two information camps, and one more on the liberal side and one more on the conservative side. And I reassured myself at the time that well, is this so different from the way things were, say, at the turn of the 20th century, in the days of the great press barons, the Pulitzers and so forth, where you could tell, you knew what was a conservative paper, a Republican paper, you knew what was a liberal paper, a Democratic paper, you knew, and so you sort of factored that in. But what we're going through right now is not that. It's worse, much worse than that, because then at least they argue from their point of view on their news pages. You could read the news pages of a Republican newspaper, and it gave you a Republican slant, and the news pages of a Democratic paper, and it gave you a Democratic slant. And then all of us here were fortunate enough to grow up in the news business at a time when the reigning ethic was to try to play it straight and to try to give people what the late great Ben Bradley used to call one good shot at the facts before we started analyzing things. But now it's not just a left-right divide. It's the fact that so many people get information that is simply wrong, and dangerous, and they're not getting it from the established media outlets on the left or the right. They're getting it from Facebook and other social media, and from people. And so, there are people in Mississippi now taking a veterinary worming drug to try to cure themselves of COVID-19, a tremendously dangerous thing. And Fox News didn't tell them to take this drug, but people that they follow and that they know on Facebook did. And so how we get at this problem in the age of the internet and social media, I think is not just different in degree, but different in kind from any sort of problem with misinformation and disinformation than we faced before. I think it's really serious.
Ted, you've heard your colleagues, and what can you contribute now, please?
Well, I'd like to pick up where Gene left off. I think the greatest danger to American democracy is the democratization of journalism. The problem is not just where we're getting the news these days. The problem is that anybody with access to an iPhone or an iPad or a computer of any kind is capable of becoming a journalist. Back in the days when Judy and Gene and I got into this business, if you wanted to be heard nationally, you had a very limited arena. You could be on one of the wire services, you could work for one of them, you could work for a major newspaper like the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, or you could work for one of the networks. These days, anybody can access potentially thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And the tragedy is that those who put on the most outrageous misinformation are likely to get the greatest number of clicks. As Gene suggested, we've had many eras in this nation's history when we have had bad journalism, but we've never had an era before when anybody, and particularly those with malicious intent, can reach out and reach an audience of millions of people. And the problem has become that by and large, the American public no longer has any confidence in people who call themselves, as the four of us have for so many years, journalists. The great tragedy is that nobody out there would hire a plumber who didn't have any background in plumbing. They certainly wouldn't go to a doctor who hadn't been to medical school, nor would they hire a lawyer who hadn't been to law school, or a carpenter who hadn't done an apprenticeship in carpentry. But as far as journalism is concerned, we are receiving input quite literally every day from millions of people who have absolutely no background in any of the disciplines that we grew up with.
Well, our current problems, as you've described them, and even beyond that, have often been compared to the buildup to the American Civil War. That's a large statement. And I wanted to ask each of you whether it's really that bad. Are we heading toward another civil war? Judy?
I certainly hope not, Marvin. I don't want to believe that that's where we are. But the language, the vitriol, the smears that are used that flow so freely on social media, as Ted was just describing, to characterize opponents, is the worst we've ever seen it. And as Ted has pointed out, and Eugene is referring to, it's now so much easier to do this. Everybody has a weapon of a kind in their possession, in that they have access to a smartphone or a laptop or an iPad or whatever it is, and they can send out inflammatory messages, language that can fire people up and get an argument going. And then we have January the 6th, which, as we all know, the worst attack on the United States Capitol since 1812. So we are in a very difficult moment. I don't want to believe we're headed literally for another civil war. But when it comes to discourse and the way we treat one another, the way we communicate with one another, and the way we disrespect and don't believe the press, that used to be one of the fundamental ways that people got information. Now the level of distrust of the media is so high, of the establishment media, that we're in a very difficult place. And I know that's what we're here to talk about. But you know, we have some challenging problems to work our way through. I don't want to believe we're headed for a civil war.
Jane, Ted, you want to contribute to?
I would just say, I certainly, like Judy, I hope not. I think it is certainly arguable, defensible to say that we're as divided as we've been, at least since that period, since that pre-Civil War period. But of course, we don't have, this overwhelming, tragic issue of slavery that divided the nation then. We don't have anything that reaches quite that magnitude. But we got it. But we got enough. Deep splits and divides over immigration, over economic dislocation, over demographic change in this country, and the fact that the census told us last week, the white non-Hispanic population of this country dropped for the first time since something like 1790, and that is creating a lot of anxiety and anger among a lot of people. So there are a lot of factors contributing, and this phenomenon of everybody being a journalist, of course, does cut both ways. Imagine the country and the world if a brave young woman hadn't stood on that street corner in Minneapolis and videoed the murder of George Floyd, and we hadn't been able to see that. That changed the world, and so it does cut both ways. But I'd say we're as divided since then, but this isn't a case of history repeating. It's more like history rhyming.
Do I see another Battle of Appomattox? No. Do I see the armies of, I don't even know whether you can call it the right and the left anymore, but the armies of Trump supporters and Trump haters arrayed in ranks against one another? No. Do I see incidents of violence cropping up all over the country? Absolutely. And I think what Gene touched on toward the end of his remarks there is precisely the same issue that has haunted this country since the beginning. It's the racial issue. And among many other things that divide this country, and sort of the undercurrent that may be driving much of the hatred, is quite clearly the fear of many whites in this country that they are no longer going to be, we are no longer going to be in the majority. And that all of a sudden, over the period of the next 10 or 20 years, we are going to find ourselves in a nation with more people of color than white people. And everything that is going on in the political maneuvering, state by state, particularly by the right wing of the Republican Party right now, is an effort to put up barricades against that eventuality.
Listening to you, my mind goes back to one of my favorite writers, Thomas Wolfe. He once did a book called "You Can't Go Home Again," and I'm wondering if we as a nation can, in a sense, go home to the best of American democracy. Is it possible to find at this point, given how serious the problem is it still possible to find a way of going back to the best in American democracy? And I am not saying that American democracy has always been at its best, far from it, but it's been pretty good. And I'm wondering in your minds whether there is time for us to recoup, to go back, to pick up the best, to restore ourselves. What do you think?
Well, Marvin, I like to think of myself as an optimist, but I have difficulty imagining how we go back at this moment. For all the reasons we've been discussing, the divisions so deep, feelings running so high. I don't see the unifying moment, the leader who's going to bring us together as a country. I mean, there have been, names that have been thrown out there at different times about who might be someone to bring the American people together, but it's hard to think of individuals who are respected greatly by both sides of this divide that we're living in right now. So how do we go back? I mean, I have a hard time imagining it. I want to believe that we can do something like that. And goodness knows there are people out there trying. There are various groups we all know. We've heard of some, maybe many, that are trying to bring people together in communities to talk about problems, to work across party lines. But then we just seem to fall back as a country into these old divisions. And whether it's over the election or whether it's over COVID, the pandemic, whether it's over, you name it, foreign policy, abortion, taxes, the divisions are so deep, and people look to the Supreme Court, they look to the great institutions that hold our country together, and Congress, and what they see is division. There's division over the presidency, over the Congress, and the highest court in the land. So I don't want to be the pessimist in the group, but I don't see it right now.
Judy, you're the optimist in this. I'm even more pessimistic than you are. However, Marvin posed the question, is there any way out of this mess? And I think the answer is the same answer that it has always been. When America is most severely divided, what brings us together is a common enemy. And these days, we have so many common enemies out there, and they are making themselves manifest every day of the week, whether it is flooding, whether it is the terrible fires out on the West Coast, whether it is the icebergs that are melting and raising the level of our seas. The fact of the matter is that we're being confronted not only by a pandemic, but we're being confronted by nature rising up against us. And whether this will happen within the near future or whether it will only happen when it is quite clearly almost too late to do anything about it, the fact that we are facing all these common dangers is, I believe, the only hope we have of bringing these different political entities back together again. When survival is at stake, I think politics will take a back seat.
That is optimism, Mr. Koppel. That is optimism. I hope you're right on that. Gene, I meant to ask you earlier a question when we talked about, you touched on racism in this country. How has journalism covered this issue? I'm curious about your judgment, particularly because you are African American and you have been absorbed with this issue your whole life.
Yeah.
Has it begun to change? Is our attitudes different? Are we moving in the right direction? Are we being told the whole story and the true story? Help us out, please.
Um, well, now I'm going to sound like Pollyanna. I mean, yes, we are moving in the right direction, and yes, we have changed. And I grew up in the Jim Crow South in Orangeburg, South Carolina. I was in the second class that integrated what had been the white high school in our town. I remember a very different America in terms of race, and it is just simply untrue to say we have made that we have not made progress on race. In fact, we have. Now that progress has never been comfortable. It has never been uninterrupted. It's always of the 2 steps forward, 1 step back variety, and it's a very scratchy, sometimes violent process that we've gone through, always on race, which is, after all, the original sin of this country since the founding. We've had to have successive refoundings of this country that have mostly sort of dealt or tried to deal, at least in part, with race. And the Civil War was obviously one of those, and then there was Reconstruction, but then Reconstruction was rolled back by Jim Crow, and we do this forward back routine. We have ended up in a much different and just objectively much better place than where we were when I was a kid. But it hasn't been easy getting here, and there's no guarantee that there's going to be any sort of uninterrupted, smooth glide path toward the better future on race that we all hope for. I think we're in for some really rough times. I get racist communications, emails, Twitter messages, snail mail, of a kind, of a viciousness, and just sort of blatant, outright racism that I haven't seen since I was a kid in South Carolina, in Strom Thurmond, South Carolina. And I didn't see in this whole intervening period yet. I'm seeing it now, and it is this, as we approach this moment when there is no white majority, there is only a white plurality. It'll be a pretty big plurality, by the way, in this country. I just see I see this heightening, and so we make progress, but the anxiety level and the anger also rises, and I think we're in for a bumpy ride.
I want to talk for a sec about journalism and how we are doing as a craft in these very difficult times. And we've all heard about the perfect journalism operating in the perfect environment, shows both sides of a story, both sides get equal weight, and that's just fine, and we move on to the next story. But supposing the story before us is so overriding in importance, such as the damage being done to American democracy at this time, does that mean that the journalist has a right or even an obligation at this point to really show not both sides of the story, but only one, knowing full well that the other side is not playing by the rules of the game? And Judy, as the head of a program at an hour every night on public television, you come upon this issue tightly. How do you manage that now?
You're right, Marvin. We come on it every single day, all day long. We're struggling. We've struggled with it, just as every other news organization or television program, trying to tell the whole story. I mean, our mission has been from the beginning of the NewsHour to try to hold a mirror up to the country to help people understand what the not just the news of the day, but also to go into the big debates of the moment, the debates of our time, and to illuminate, to shed light, and to bring all points of view, not to lean one way or another. I mean, our mantra has been let the viewer, let our readers or followers online make up their own minds. But we've been through, certainly through the Trump era, the presidency, and even the candidacy of Donald Trump, with a completely bifurcated Republican Party, with many Republicans embracing Donald Trump and many other Republicans rejecting him, that the old, left and right just doesn't work anymore. And it's been a challenge. It's been a challenge to figure out what to do when you have elected lawmakers come on the program and make statements that are demonstrably false, that don't have any basis in fact. And it challenges us to think about our format and our approach. We've traditionally treated our guests with respect, and we don't generally like to interrupt people, but frankly, if someone is making a string of statements that aren't factual, how do we correct that, or how do we ask them to correct it? And we haven't done a perfect job of it. We haven't done a perfect job. We still struggle with it every day.
I was thinking that of a story that my old CBS colleague, Richard C. Honnold, told me quite a few times. He covered World War II. He was there at that time. And he said at that time that an American reporter obviously wanted the Americans to win and the Nazis to lose. They hated the Nazis, and they allowed their copy every now and then to reflect their own judgment that America has to win. And I'm wondering at this point, given the problems that we've been discussing facing our democracy today, whether journalism has to sit down at this point and come up with another way of dealing with a new appreciation of a different responsibility that it has to the public. Ted, help me out on that.
Well, first of all, Judy, of all the people in this business I know right now, you have the least to engage in self-criticism about. You and the NewsHour every evening, Monday through Friday, provide precisely the kind of decent, objective, professional coverage that we need so badly in this business. I think a little bit of history, Marvin, might be helpful. Up until 1987 in this country, broadcasting was governed by something called the Fairness Doctrine, which obliged all license holders, that meant all people who owned radio stations, television stations, and the networks, to provide at least an opportunity for both sides, particularly of a political story, to be told. In 1988, under significant pressure from the Republican right, the Fairness Doctrine was dumped. And within a few months, a young man by the name of Rush Limbaugh began doing a radio program in which there was absolutely no pretense at even-handedness. He was an unabashed and proud conservative Republican, and his program became the model for numerous other radio programs like it, and ultimately for television programs, and indeed the television network that was started by Rupert Murdoch, Fox. So we've come a long way from those days back in the 70s and 80s, when most of us grew up in this profession. And when we knew that we had an obligation to be as even-handed as possible. And even-handedness has never meant focusing on a story where the evil of one side is manifestly obvious. That didn't mean that we were obliged then to give the other side. Hitler on the one side and the Allies on the other side. I don't think that was ever really the case. But the kind of objectivity that we at least worked for back in the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, I think could use a little refreshing.
What do you mean by that? Refreshing in what sense? What do you do with the objectivity? How do you change it?
Well, in the sense that, for example, when I tune in Morning Joe and I see my friend Eugene Robinson on there expressing his opinions, I got no problem with that whatsoever. Eugene Robinson is an opinion writer for the Washington Post. He is a columnist. I read him because I want to know his opinion. I listen to him because I want to hear his opinion. But I'm not sure that all the young men and women who are reporters on MSNBC or Fox or CNN are necessarily entitled to express their opinions. I really don't want to hear their opinions. I want to hear an as objective a telling of the news as possible. And lest I be accused of having left my old alma mater or my current sometime employer, CBS, ABC, NBC out. Fact of the matter is, I'm very much concerned that the evening newscasts there, rather than focusing on the most important events taking place in the world, they tend to be looking at what's trending on social media and then reflecting that in their newscasts because it is the most popular. We need to have some kind of a return to professional standards and a seeking of objectivity. That doesn't mean that you are obliged to do a on the one hand, on the other hand, but it does mean that you have to look at it far more professionally than many of us are doing these days.
Eugene Robinson, are you aware in the world of journalism that there's any effort to do what it is, in a general sense, to do what it is that Ted has just recommended? Are you aware of any of that happening today?
Well, I think a little, but not enough. I agree with Ted. I think again, we all grew up at the same time in journalism, and we grew up with this idea that there is a wall between news and opinion, and that wall is impermeable. And so it is not the business of news reporters to give opinions. It is not the business. It is the business of opinion writers to give opinions, because that's what we get paid to do. But to ground those opinions in some evidence, some fact, to marshal an argument, to argue a case, I think we have we're getting to the point where we don't necessarily assume that on every story there are precisely two sides. There might be three sides to a story. There might be only one. But I think if journalists, both news and opinion, can be on a side, on anybody's side, we can be on the side of journalism, and that means we have to be on the side of facts. And I think that's kind of where we have to start. I'm grinning because I'm thinking of I think it was a CNN report from that weird sort of conspiracy theory convention that the My Pillow guy had recently, in which he claimed he was going to prove the election was stolen, and someone who was a CNN reporter was interviewing someone who was attending the gathering, and who told the reporter, you guys just need to report this stuff and stop fact checking. Well, that's absolutely wrong. I mean, we need, fact checking ought to be fact has to be the basis, the starting point for what we do. Even before we talk about once again establishing a firmer line between news and opinion, which I think we should do.
No, but this is very interesting, because it seems to me I'm listening to professional journalism agonizing about what you do at a time when there is an overriding story, there's no question about what's happening. And yet, you want so desperately to be fair, balanced, fact-based, and you're hoping that your audience is going to go along for the ride. But the data suggests now that your audience is not going along for the ride, that they want to hear their facts. And if that be a definition of our current political environment, does it not call out for a new judgment on the part of journalists about what it is that they should do now? Because the problem is before us now. What do you think?
Well, Marvin, I think I mean, for me, there's only one answer, and that is to pursue the facts. I mean, you were asking what news organizations are still doing that. The Associated Press, for one, what is it? They have more reporters around the world than I believe any other news organization. And there are still pockets of our most prominent news organizations that have reporters out digging every day for information.
Absolutely.
There are obviously decisions made by editors to weigh one side of a story or one set of facts over another and choosing placement in the story and headlines and so forth. But we're still about going after the facts, gathering information, seeking truth. We'll never get there. We'll never get ultimately to truth, in my opinion. But we can continue to strive for it and look for it. I think our mission is very clear. And if it means people stop watching or stop reading and go in another direction, I don't know what we do. I mean, but we have to keep at it, because I have to believe that at some point in the future, you asked earlier about a solution. If there's a solution, it's going to come from the younger generation. I mean, I really want to believe that the younger generation coming along, at least it's my hope, that they're watching all this and saying, I can't, this is not acceptable. We've got to do it better than this. There's got to be a better way.
The younger generation, Judy,
Yeah.
according to the polls, the younger generation is absorbed with the new technology, with social media. And that's an interesting subject also. On social media, you can find opinions that are way extreme, one side or the other. At the same time, you can also see on social media a chronicling of events as they happen. And journalists use that information to convey it then, sometimes as truth, sometimes as questionable stuff, but they convey it. We're all apparently hooked in, trapped by the new technology. And I keep on asking myself, is there a use of the new technology that will allow us to be comfortable in its use in projecting fact, truth, going back to the origins, what I said earlier on, that commonly accepted understanding, which I am hoping can somehow be recaptured. And somehow with the young people, the journalism schools, somehow I hope it's going to work. It's just that at the moment, the data suggests we're tipping the other way.
Marvin, I think you've left out, we all have left out a rather major feature of what's happening to journalism in this country today. And that is the business side, the economics of it. Fox became enormously profitable. I think the Murdoch empire was pulling in somewhere between $1 and $2 billion a year. And when the folks over at NBC saw that, they had their own little cable outfit, MSNBC, which wasn't doing anything. And I think the assumption had to be, well, if Fox can pull in all that money on the right, even if we can only pull in half of that on the left, let's do it. And they have, and they did, and they are. And they're making a ton of money doing it. And unless and until we can find a way to take the profit factor out of news coverage, and I don't think we've ever been able to totally do that, But again, I come back to the days when the FCC, with its control over the licenses of broadcast networks and broadcast radio stations and broadcast television stations, did exercise some control. And they made it clear to the owners of those licenses that if you want to hold on to your license, you have got to serve the public interest, necessity, and convenience. That's not a phrase I made up. That's straight out of the FCC rule. Now, with cable and social media, it may be impossible to reimpose those kinds of disciplines.
And then what do we do?
Well, it may not, it seems to me, unfortunately, it may not matter if we impose those different disciplines on broadcast and cable.
Yes,
with
absolutely.
so many people getting their news from social media. And as we begin to understand, and there's been some work on this, how the most outrageous and outlandish and generally untrue but tendentious kinds of information or purported information goes viral much more easily than the somewhat more boring and pedestrian fact-based version of the story, whatever the story is. How do we work against that? That's playing those are algorithms that are playing on the way human beings are built, the way our minds are the way our minds work. What attracts our attention and rivets our attention and makes us want to pass something on to our friends.
Gene, I think we're going to go back to Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. There is a desperate need for good, reliable, professional journalism. We can't hope, certainly not at the broadcasting end of things, because people under the age of 50 I don't think are watching the news at all anymore. Judy, do you know what your age factor is in terms of your viewership?
Well, like all of television news, it's older. There's no question the younger generation gets their news online. But Ted, a lot of the stories they look to are stories that come from the New York Times or CBS or even the NewsHour on PBS. I mean, those stories that they're reading online are often distilled from mainstream media. Not all of them. Clearly, there's a whole industry of what we've been talking about, both fake news and distorted news and opinion news that they can dip into, but they're also dipping into and reading the mainstream media.
No, I think you're right. And as I said at the outset, I think you represent a perfect example of what I'm talking about. I think if our industry as a whole reestablishes its commitment to that kind of journalism and simply does it and puts it out there, and you're quite right. Frankly, I don't care whether somebody reads what Eugene Robinson says on Twitter, or whether they watch it on television or read it in the Washington Post. It's worth reading, it's worth hearing. And if enough of us put out enough really good, solid material, perhaps large segments of the American population will begin to realize that living in a country in which you can't believe anything anymore is not good for anyone.
We don't have a great deal of time left in this hour, but I don't want it to pass without our trying to understand the role of the media right now in what is happening and has been happening in Afghanistan in the effort to get as many Americans and friendly Afghans out as possible. Your judgment, please. How has the American press done with respect to that very, very important job? Gene, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think I believe, frankly, that the American news media, particularly those organizations like mine, who have had reporters and locally hired journalists and others in Afghanistan who are on the scene and who are invested in the place and in the story, are doing a good job of covering it, and are arguably doing more of a we're doing a very big deal treatment of the story. It is a very big deal.
As we're recording this, Marvin, we're just 8 days into the fall of the Afghanistan government and into the chaotic scenes that we've seen at the airport in Kabul. So we don't know how this is going to turn out. We don't know how many thousands of people. We know the commitment is to get Americans out and to get as many Afghan allies out as possible. We don't know how that's going to turn out. I think the reporting on the ground, for the most part, has been good. I mean, as always, in a situation like this where there's a potential for human tragedy, reporters are telling that story. I think the challenge for all of us is to keep the sweep of the historic perspective of what's happened in Afghanistan in mind, the fact that this goes back 20 years and even farther back in history, and to keep that in mind as we watch what's happening right now. That's always our challenge.
I asked you before, what can be done to try to save American democracy? I don't want to be over dramatic about it, but there are big things happening. It's obvious, it's before our eyes. And I was wondering what we could do to recapture the best of our democracy. And I'd like to ask now, because there has been so much criticism of the media, some of it grotesquely unfair, but nevertheless, it is out there. Millions, tens of millions of people actually buy into it. And you guys are all part of it. And I'm just wondering now, please think back and help us understand, how can journalism be better? How can it win back the trust of people? How can it be what it is, so essential to our democracy? Ted, why don't we start with you?
I'm reading an autobiography right now of a French philosopher, journalist, who, in talking about Soviet Russia, said that there was nothing more dangerous in the communist world than being right at the wrong time. It's a very profound comment. And we have to be unafraid about being right at the wrong time. I think this is a theme that has cropped up in just about every answer that you've elicited from the three of us, Marvin. We're all pretty much on the same page. We need to do what those of us who are now much closer to the ends of our careers than the beginning, what we have been doing for a lifetime in journalism. And that is trying to provide the facts, trying to provide truth where that's possible, but also trying to provide context.
I would just follow on Ted by saying, go back to the basics. We need to go back to the fundamental things that we were taught as young journalists, and that is report. Seek the facts, shine a light on information that people don't know and that they need to know. It sounds pretty simple, but that's what we need to do. And by the way, restoring our democracy, as all of us know, is a much bigger question. There are plenty of things that need to be done with our political system, getting money out of politics and a lot of other things. But in terms of journalism, I think we stick to the basics. And I'm hoping the younger generation will see that too.
Thank you, Judy. Gene, please.
I'll just say I agree with Ted and Judy. And I also just point out that journalism alone isn't going to save democracy. We should do our level best, but our elected officials, our fellow citizens, it's going to take a bigger effort than just journalists.
Thank you. Thanks to the three of you. My own take, for what it's worth, is that the press, the media, whatever you want to call it, is the key to our democracy, absolutely the key. And when the press is gagged anywhere in the world, democracy withers and perhaps even dies. The essential responsibility of a journalist is to tell truth to power, to expose corrupt politicians, and in that way, strengthen our democracy. The late Congressman John Lewis once said that without the press, the civil rights movement would have been like a bird without wings. Imagine our democracy without the wings of a free press. And that's it for now. My thanks to our audience wherever you are in this pandemic, and my deep gratitude to three great journalists, Judy Woodruff, Eugene Robinson, and Ted Koppel, who have so eloquently shared their experiences, their feelings, their judgments. I'm Marvin Kalb, and as Ed Murrow used to say many, many years ago, good night and good luck.